For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. For half of the book of Isaiah, the prophet has been warning the people about the trouble that will befall them if they do not mend their ways. The second half describes what indeed has happened to the people and what their restoration might look like in the near future. People sometimes read the Bible as if it were perfectly true in any one moment. They quote a verse or two at a time, usually out of context, to get some point across, like shape up or bad things are going to happen. But the book of Isaiah is a long story, one that likely spanned well beyond one person's lifetime. It begins historically in about the year 730 BCE, before the Assyrian Empire has moved into the neighborhood, and it ends 200 years later. Not only has the Babylonian Empire risen and fallen in that time, the new Persian Empire has just taken over. Isaiah would not have lived to see the conclusion of his own book, which of course means that somebody picked up where he left off. That's not unusual in the Bible, even if by tradition one person is credited with a whole book. That is the purpose of the Bible in its way, to offer wisdom from a people across many centuries. It's only in recent times, though, that this has been transformed from a collection of ancient lessons and allegorical stories into wooden literalism and harsh morality. Be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating, for I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy, and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard, or the cry of distress. Now that the Babylonians have been defeated, things can get back to the way they were. Mostly. The Persians would still be in charge, but the people could return to Jerusalem and to their way of life. This reversal of fate is significant, so significant, in fact, that the Persian emperor Cyrus the Great is referred to as the Messiah, one chosen by God to deliver the people of Israel from their suffering and their despair. Messiah is not a unique term within Judaism, but it's a high status title, one that is reserved for those who are acting at the direction of God. The word means anointed one and would then eventually be used by the followers of Jesus during his lifetime to describe him as the leader who would save them once again, like Cyrus. No more shall there be in any infant, may it be that an infant lives but a few days, or that an older person does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. It's interesting to consider the passage in a modern context. An infant dying is now indeed a tragedy rather than commonplace. Not everyone lives to be 100, but it's far more likely that people will live many more years than at least in ancient times. It's an improvement. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. This part references the life of bondage that the people had been living, many dislocated in Babylon serving their captors. But the people would now be able to build their own houses, plant their own crops. They would enjoy the fruits of their own labors. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. But the serpent, its food shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. This passage is often interpreted eschatologically, meaning that it has to do with the final days of humankind and the ultimate fate of the world. But that was not likely the intention behind these words, at least in the time of Isaiah. It was more likely poetic hyperbole, a way of conveying the jubilation of the people that what they would feel once their years of captivity were over. That's not to diminish their meaning, but to reconsider how they've been characterized 2,500 years later by more literally minded interpreters. Which leads us back to the beginning. We heard from Isaiah, "For I am about to create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind." Even if we think of these words as relating to some long time past, it's worth imagining what they would mean if something were to happen now, if everything were to be new. Is it even a good idea? Well, I imagine that would depend upon whether things are already good for us. Good for me, good for you, good for someone. But is it good for everyone? What would it look like for the world to be good? From the book of Isaiah, it is about freedom from oppression and occupation, the freedom to make our own way in the world. But notice that people are still planting crops. They are still tending their vineyards. This is not utopian fantasy, but a change in how the people lead their lives. And then there's the obvious exaggeration, the hyperbole about the wolf and the lamb eating together, the lion eating straw, the serpent feeding on dust. If we look at this passage as not being literal but allegorical, we must consider what or who is really meant by these animal images. The age Isaiah and his people were living through was one of great conflict, with imperial powers trampling across the Middle East again and again. The wolf eats the lion eats the lamb. Regular people are, of course, the helpless lambs at the mercy of these predators, these powerful and warlike people. The new heaven and earth would hinge upon a fundamental change in that dynamic, with people no longer being preyed upon by one another. The serpent eating dust, now that is an obvious connection back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and they were punished, along with the serpent. They had to toil for their nourishment rather than simply eat freely in paradise. Isaiah was not describing a paradise. He was not describing some unattainable state of being. No, this was supposed to be possible. So how would we get there? Well, in some ways, we've gotten closer. People do live longer. Children do not frequently succumb to childhood illness and hunger. Of course, that is a rather limited and privileged perspective. In the United States, people live longer. Children live longer. The blessings of one place do not necessarily make it everywhere. Even in the United States, there are marked differences between how people can live and how long they might live. What should we do about that? What would a new and better world look like? One that is more than the promises given 1,000 or so years ago. One that is more than just poetic hyperbole. What would a new world look like, and how might we try to bring that about? Well, any number of people have tried to change the world. They've written philosophies. They've offered up divine revelations. They've designed communities with these philosophies and revelations in mind. Some of these were utopian in nature. Bear in mind that the word utopia was a Greek pun, with the word meaning both a good place and no place at all. When thinking about how to bring about change in the world, there are different approaches. There is maintaining the status quo, so really no changes at all. There is reforming a society, meaning fixing it from within, relying upon the existing system and changing this or that from within to bring about a better overall result. And then there's revolution. Revolution meaning clearing everything away, really trying to start from scratch. But even revolutions begin with some kind of foundation. No one starts a revolution and then tries to design a whole new language. And the more radical the proposed revolutionary changes, the more resistance one might inspire within ever larger groups of people. During the French Revolution, for example, there was an effort to rename all the months. One of the summer months would have been called Thermidor, meaning the hot month. The effort to make that fundamental change to the calendar was actually considered to be the true beginning of the end of that wave of the French Revolution. Why bother changing the names of the month? To demonstrate one's commitment to breaking away from the past. But it's difficult to break such long-standing historical connections. In fact, it's so difficult that people rarely do so. They often suggest that they're doing that, but then they do something else far less radical. For example, in Ireland, one of the national saints is Saint Bridget. She was said to have lived around the year 500 or so and was an abbess, meaning she was the chief nun of a convent near Kildare. Bridget also happens to be the name of one of the ancient goddesses of the Celtic religion. She was particularly revered on the spring festival of Imbolc, which also happens to be the feast day of St. Bridget. That's not to say that St. Bridget didn't exist, but her name and her feast day are rather conveniently used in this way to co-opt ancient practice. In 2 weeks, we will be celebrating a modern American feast, Thanksgiving. There are many ways to understand this day. For many people, it is a time for families to get together from near and far. The song Over the River and Through the Woods is a Thanksgiving song, though it is occasionally co-opted into Christmas. Perhaps that tune is now stuck in your head, and you have my apologies for that. The song was written by Lydia Child, a 19th century Unitarian, known for her works as both an abolitionist and as an advocate for the rights of indigenous peoples. That's a complicated legacy, given that Thanksgiving is not considered a day of celebration to many indigenous people in the United States. It is for some a day of mourning, a day to commemorate the suffering of Native Americans at the hands of English colonists and the nation of the United States itself. An uncomfortable story in many ways, and yet we celebrate that day all the same. Well, the origins of Thanksgiving are interesting. Days of Thanksgiving were observed by English Puritans and their religious cousins, the Pilgrims. A day of Thanksgiving would be called after a good harvest or some other blessed event. Well, as the story goes, the Wampanoag people had shared their food with the Pilgrims, whose supplies had run low before the winter. And during the next harvest season, the Pilgrims celebrated for 3 days, and they invited the Wampanoag to attend. One historical account of this event suggests that the Wampanoag, particularly their leader Massasoit, was trying to make an alliance with the rather well-armed Pilgrims. The Wampanoag were trying to shore up their defenses against the Narragansett tribe to the south in what would eventually become Rhode Island. While the Wampanoag had suffered greatly from the epidemic of smallpox brought over by waves of Europeans, the Narragansett were mostly spared and therefore were perceived as a threat. We can look back at that momentary alliance as a fleeting attempt at a longer-term peace. It didn't work out that way, but for both the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. Much like the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, these people were pushed out of their lands that were occupied by others. And so the Pilgrim-inspired holiday and its place within our complicated national history can mean different things to different people. And beyond this problematic example, the idea of giving thanks, though, is an ancient and common custom across cultures. It's not the idea of gratitude that we have to be wrestling with, but the legacy of one group's imposition of itself upon another. The Wampanoag and the Narragansett were seemingly at odds at one point, just like the people of Israel and Judah had fought their own territorial wars against their neighbors, like the Philistines. Someone can be both the hero and the villain, the victim and the victor in a story. And if you tell stories over a long enough period, such labels can be swapped back and forth. That is really the nature of many of the stories in the Bible. The question then becomes how you change the narrative cycle. How do you change that cycle of violence and retribution that often typifies the history of the world? And it's not as if we can simply reverse the clock back to some point in history. There was no perfect moment when everything was right and fair in the world. There is no simple solution, no simple way of just repairing what we think is broken. But if we think about our scripture reading again, we might begin to imagine a way to improve upon the past. The wolf and the lion, well, they don't get to eat the lamb anymore. The serpent does not get to have its way. And by serpent, I mean ideas about the world that declare inherent winners and losers, the high and the low set in place for all time. Because that is often what is at the root of these enduring injustices. One group thinks it's chosen while everyone else is there to serve them. And that is the playbook of every imperial power, ancient and modern. We deserve that land, we deserve that wealth, we deserve all of this power. We deserve it because our stories tell us that we deserve it. Our stories would never mislead us, would they? In the story of Thanksgiving, we tell one comforting truth about the history of that day while ignoring a wider truth about the history of our country. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving. It means that we should remember the good with the bad, the blessing of those people surviving another harsh year, and the suffering of others who lost so much in the years to come. Days of Thanksgiving would be called by the Puritans to mark their good fortune, and days of fasting would be declared in response to terrible misfortunes. The Puritans believed that God was the source of all of these blessings and all of this suffering. But we don't need to be in such a mechanistic system to appreciate the good things we've received and to reflect upon the suffering in the world. We can feel gratitude and we can mourn loss. We can feel pride in our history and heritage without glossing over all the terrible things done in our nation. Terrible things done even by those we might count as ancestors. The proverbial wolves and lions of old can and should change, to turn from violence, of course, but also to expand their understanding of the past. I am not one for casting aside uncomfortable history, and I also do not think discomfort is reason enough to move away onto a different topic. History holds room enough for the stories of those who have suffered along with those who have triumphed. And we must remember such stories because if we don't, we risk repeating dark history. We might cling to happy stories of golden ages in which the oppressed somehow enjoyed their bondage. We might try to come out as the hero all the time, as the good guy, without realizing that we're just one story away from being the wolf or the lion rather than the lamb. And we might be one more story, one more decision away from rejecting or embracing the serpent. What is the best way to prevent such bad choices? Keep telling the truth to ourselves, the good and the bad. Try listening to the stories of others, the good and the bad, the ugly and the uncomfortable. We need to do this. We need to do this because it's the only way to protect the lamb from the wolf. And the way you do that is you recognize the wolf. And you also need to remember that maybe once upon a time, we were the wolf. Amen.